it's time to complicate this narrative of well-being. When you've had difficult times in your own life, times that you might describe as a crisis, how did you cope? It would be wonderful if when we went through the hardest times in our life, what happened was that our positive coping mechanisms kick it in high gear. But oftentimes, the opposite happens. In my own life, I stopped being able to eat and I lost almost 20 pounds. I started smoking again, something I hadn't done since college. And I started drinking more. Ultimately, I had to find a new path. I had to find tools that would work for me. I started reaching out and sharing more with others than I ever had before. And what I ultimately learned is that I wasn't the only one, and the sense of shame and alienation that I was feeling dissipated. And instead, I felt a greater sense of connection. This is called a common humanity intervention. That moment when we look around and we realize that we're not alone. And tools like this have been shown to mitigate the impacts of stress. When clients started calling again, organizations and individuals were in crisis. So I did a series of virtual workshops on dealing with difficult emotions. And what I heard coming through the chat was that people were saying they were overwhelmed with anxiety, that they were crying every day, that they didn't know how they were going to make it through. And while the work that I had been doing with communities had always been vulnerable, I had never seen anything like the big emotions that I was experiencing then. A few months later, I was asked to fly to another state to facilitate a keynote. I was told that the community that I would work in had been grieving and that they'd lost community members in the pandemic. And while it was supposed to be a mandatory session, only a fraction of the community showed up. Most of them couldn't make eye contact with me. One woman sat in the back of the room and cried. It was moments like this that solidified for me that the ways that I had been talking about well-being were no longer enough. The question I had been asking is this: how can we cope with our environments so that we can be well? But the question that I needed to be asking was this: how can we change our environments so that we don't have to try so hard to cope? Just to set a bit of context, up to 55% of health outcomes can be attributed to social determinants. And that far outweighs any of the consequences of our individual behaviors. So while we might, based upon our public and organizational conversations, assume that the impacts of well-being look something like this, mostly we're talking about stress and burnout, a little bit about mental health, and occasionally we're mentioning the impacts of trauma. Really, the conversation should be looking a lot more like this. And so what we're sometimes calling stress or burnout is actually an appropriate response to an unsupportive environment. In order to be healthy as individuals and as communities, we must feel safe to tell the truth, and our truth must make an impact. This is how we change well-being. So in this context, we have different roles that we can fulfill at each of these levels. At the self level, we can play the role of an advocate. At the group level, we play the role of a space holder. And at the organizational level, we play the role of a leader. Advocacy is the ability to use our voice to speak the truth. Space holding is the ability to have conversations based upon equality and human dignity instead of power and hierarchy. And leadership is the ability to receive feedback and respond with empathy and action. And in this context, anyone can be a leader. Anyone who is able to receive the truth of another person and change themselves or change a situation is a leader. So you might be asking, what's my role? And the answer for you and every single one of your employees is all of them. In the same day, we may be called to fulfill each of these roles And so in this context, the question becomes, what's my role right now? And how do I best fulfill that role? And have you spoken up when a situation conflicted with your values? Because that's advocacy. Have you led a conversation where every person's voice was heard and valued equally? Because that's space holding. And have you listened to feedback and responded with empathy and action and made a change? Because that's leadership. And all of us can fulfill every one of these roles if we have the tools. It is my belief, it is my experience that we can create these same oases of hope in our social and emotional landscape. Places where we can go and rejuvenate ourselves so that we can go back out into less hospitable climates and do the essential work that matters to us. It is in these places where we can find and honor our voice as advocates. We can hold space to honor the voices and truth of others. And we can lead by honoring the call to change within ourselves and our communities. Thank you.